So good morning.
Good morning.
If you want to come a little closer, this isn't church. You can come a little closer if you want. I know you see a priest up front, so
Catholics always sit.
But welcome. My name is Father Patrick Keating. I'm the CEO of Catholic Migration Services and the Deputy CEO of Catholic Charities. And here today, I'm joined by Edward Clancy, who's the Director of Outreach for Aid to the Church in Need, as well as Michael de la Civita, who is the Communication Director for the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. And as you saw the topic, it's about refugee. And I'm here to moderate, and these two fine gentlemen are really going to do most of the talking. But what I did want to do is, as we begin this conversation, and at the end I hope you have some questions, that understanding of what is a refugee. We hear it so often, and we're here on World Communication Day. But a refugee has a very specific definition according to the United Nations and according to U.S. law. It's basically someone who has left their country based on a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of five categories: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or being a member of a particular social group. It's a very defined definition that came out in 1951. It's been incorporated by 150 countries who have signed on to that convention. And it's important, I think, because we hear the news so often, we confuse immigrants with refugees. And refugees are people really fearing persecution based on one of those five categories that I mentioned. And so I just want to kind of pass up, before we go into it, maybe just have Michael and Edward, I'm going to pass the microphone to Edward first, just speak a little about their organization, because I think both organizations do tremendous work that I think is so important.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for listening to me, being here. My name, as Father said, is Edward Clancy, and I am the Director of Outreach for Aid to the Church in Need, which is a pontifical organization, as Catholic Near East is, which means we're under the Holy See, but our focus is to serve the church in places of persecution and suffering. And we were founded by a Dutch Norbertine after World War II, and his vision, or his idea back then, was to help to provide for German refugees. And they literally were refugees from Europe going back to Germany. And so the area of refugees and being the voice of refugees is very important to us as it goes back to our founding. And so I thank you all for coming here. And although this isn't church, we will take up a collection.
Thanks, Ed. Mike La Civita, Catholic Near East Welfare Association. We're an agency of the Holy See that was founded 90 years ago in March by Pope Pius XI. At that time, in Europe and in the Middle East, they were going through something that we're familiar with these days: an exchange of populations, refugees, principally in those days Greeks, Turks, Armenians, Chaldeans, etc. And a little-known Greek Catholic bishop in Istanbul, Constantinople at the time, reached out to Father Paul Watson here in New York, and there was a Benedictine that was running around from Europe who came to the United States, and they started work here in New York in the mid-20s to raise funds to assist the local church reach out to refugees. In 1926, Pope Pius XI founded that organization, which I represent today as its communications director. We work principally with the Eastern churches, solely with the Eastern churches, wherever they are in need. So we provide assistance that's both humanitarian and pastoral, and we're led by Monsignor John Kozar, but the chair of our board is always the Archbishop of New York. But oddly enough, we're papal, yet we're led by the Archbishop of New York, so it's one of those crazy things that came about after the First World War. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you.
Since we are here to kind of talk about refugees, I guess I want to ask the two of you, when you hear the word refugee crisis, what does this call to mind for each of you?
The images that we often see in the news of people moving, of walking with very little possessions, maybe only the clothes on their back, is the visual image that I see first when I think of refugee. But I also see something else, or think of something else, and that is the depletion of culture. That you see within communities, these people who are just faces, but what they represented where they left. I mean, they left a place where they were integral to the very fabric of society, and now it's gone. We saw it, we've seen it in Africa, we've seen it all the time in the Middle East and in Asia and all these other places, but sometimes we don't think about is what they left, not the horror that they're leaving and the violence, but the society that they were part of, the building blocks, the fabric that kept things together. And as Christians, it's important for us to understand that role of people in the community, but also to look more deeply at the Christian presence in these places and what that meant and what that means. That when a place has a Christian presence, there almost always is a more peaceful society. There's less likely of struggle, and we see that in places like Nigeria, for example, where in the north, which is mainly Muslim, there was Boko Haram rampant. And yet in the south, it wasn't so much, but there's a greater Christian population. And another thing that we see in communities where there's a Christian presence is higher value towards advanced education. We see advanced institutions and better social structure. And the other thing is that in plural societies, it's sort of like when you go to your investment advisor and they always talk to you and say, diversify, don't have all your eggs in one basket. Well, that's another thing that is lost in these refugee situations, because usually it's one group that's being persecuted or pushed out, and when they are purged of an area, then there's a great reliance on one particular aspect of a culture. And in the example with Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, we see now that there are 1.9 million people who have left their homes and probably can't go back. If they can, it's going to take a long time. And 12 million children wandering the streets of Nigeria, all because of this turmoil. And then you look at what else happened, and that's the fact that in those societies you see a decline in the functionality of the governments. In the Middle East, which Michael can speak greatly on, we see Christians in roles where they are very important administrators or very important leaders in the political sphere. And that really helps to show us when we have a refugee situation that these things can be pulled away, and specifically as Christians, what the Christian position in those societies is and will mean if it's lost.
Well, I guess when I think of refugees, I'm looking at this carpet, listening to what Ed had to say. And I'm thinking he's, of course, referring to the fabric of society. Imagine this carpet without the orange threads and the yellow threads and the blue threads and the gray threads and the charcoal threads. What would we have? We'd have a concrete floor, or we would have some sort of an undercarpet. That's what is happening. That's what I think of when I think of refugees, particularly in the Middle East, but also in Northeast Africa, in places like Ethiopia and Eritrea. I see incredibly rich societies that I've happened to come to know in these last 27 years, somewhat intimately, all of a sudden unraveled, coming apart at the seams, not just Christian cultures, but the entire culture. The former Crown Prince of Jordan, who is a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, has written books about the Middle East's Christian population and says that without the Christians of the Middle East, there is no Middle East. This is a descendant of the Prophet, recognizing one minority group. There are many minority groups in that part of the world. And so what we see more and more when I think of refugees, when I think of people in flight, when I think of displacement, I think of a vacuum cleaner that has sort of gotten out of control and has sucked up everything off of this carpet and left us with threads. And what's the purpose of a carpet? The purpose of a carpet is to provide comfort. And there isn't going to be comfort for many of those people that remain in that part of the world.
Maybe a question for both of you. As we've been talking about, particularly some of the horrors of the refugee crisis, both when you look at the media, both secular and Christian, sometimes, I think in this past year, I think particularly with some of the stuff with ISIS, these horrors are used to support various ideologies. How can we always humanize the victims, or how can we look at the individual person and see what they represent, as opposed to just seeing sometimes the horror is so bad that we just are turned away from it, or it becomes one of many things and we lose. It becomes a part of the wave of of refugees. Becomes a wave, and we lose sight of that individual person.
Please. Ideology is very dangerous, and ideology drives people away from things. It's exclusive in its very nature. And I find that ideology sometimes dehumanizes these folks, dehumanizes refugees, dehumanizes the needs of just people in flight. And when I think of certainly one of our greatest challenges at Catholic Nearest Welfare Association is not just combating the ideology that's ISIS, but combating the ideology that exists in the United States or in Canada, in Europe, in wanting to somehow assist or utilizing the plight of these folks to somehow advance their own ideologies. And that hurts our cause. That hurts what we're trying to do as church, to meet the needs of refugees, meet the needs of people in flight, migrants, whatever they are. To be, as Father was saying, to be a refugee is, you have to qualify, you have to basically register, you have to meet a certain specific category. You have to fill out paperwork, believe it or not. Many of the folks that we're talking about have never had that opportunity to register as a refugee. They're simply in flight. They are displaced persons. They're displaced whether it's within Syria or within Iraq, and so they don't get the benefits. And what we're seeing is many of these people are being utilized by various groups. Sometimes their concerns are good, sometimes they're not so good, for a particular ideology to serve a purpose. So it's important not to be thinking about, and when you're reporting on this, many of you were journalists, not to be thinking about the ideology sometimes that's behind it, or should we be advocating for this or pushing for that. They're victims of ideology. Let's look at their personhood, their individuality, the fact that they're children of God. It doesn't matter if they're Christian or Muslim or Turkmen or Shia or what have you. They're individuals created in the image and likeness of God, who have lost their homes, who've been uprooted from their societies, who are in fear, something that many of us understand. And in the Middle East, many of these people are middle class. They had jobs, they were farmers, or they were technicians, or they were bureaucrats, or they were people like us who had families, who had homes and grandparents and celebrated weddings and funerals and marriages, etc. And now all of that is gone. And so to remember just the basics of what makes us human is important in talking about these individuals as individuals, not necessarily as victims of an ideology, and we don't want to victimize them again to serve our own ideologies.
I think as a Catholic and as Christians, for me, I've had, I guess, technically 5 popes, although Pope John Paul I was only for a month, but all of them have had these wonderful messages, and they've spread an ideology that's built on 3 cores of faith, hope, and love. And so when I think about this conflict and these people, I think of them, in essence, looking at them and saying, what was lost? Father Cantalamessa, who was the preacher at the papal household, was at Steubenville, and I happened to be there when he was there, and I heard him preach about hope. And he said that hope is like the little child on the beach pulling its parents of faith and love down the shore of the beach. Because it's hope that leads us forward. We can have faith and we can have love, but if there's no hope, then things change. we've heard from now, I guess, internally displaced people, to be correct, in Iraq. And they've spoken of 18 months ago, of going back home, of going back to where they came from, to the Nineveh plain, and speaking of, how they might rebuild the town when they get there. And then 16 months later, they're talking about trying to get their children out of Iraq because they've lost hope. And I think of that as the human dimension, the fact that, one of my favorite movies, The Shawshank Redemption, there's a scene at the table in the cafeteria when one character speaking to another talks about hope, and Red, played by I lost his name for a second, but anyway, he said hope is a very dangerous thing because once you hope, you start to dream. And this is the thing that I think about, the human level of dreams lost. Both Catholic Near-East Welfare Association and Aid to the Church in Need have featured a video of a little girl named Miriam. And she's speaking to her friend, and speaking to our friend to say not to lose hope, that we will sing again. And recently we did another video, and she's thanking people who have helped her. And so we've had the opportunity to help them in this area of the world by building schools in Erbil to take care of the 18 or 20,000 young children that came. And the same thing is true when we have issues in other countries, that you see the human face and how it's changed, that when they face the adversity, the first act of violence, they tend to be rather strong. They tend to be somewhat resolved in their conviction to return or to overcome. But when you see that hope gone, that is when the situation is very dire. And unfortunately, in many of these places, for example, in Nigeria and places like Haiti and other places, there is a malaise, a general sense that this is the way it's always going to be. And for us as agency and us as Christians, we have to overcome that. We have to start to help them to remember that there is hope, that aside from the theological message of Jesus Christ, there's hope in brotherhood, there's hope in us, that we can provide for them in some way. And our founder, who was a Dutch Norbertine, said, when he took the role of Aid to the Church in Need under his arms or into his arms, he said that as a Norbertine, I gave away everything, but I did not give away my voice, and that I give to them. And this is what's important for you out there, that you, as journalists, many, to provide a message of truth, but hope, to not, get them crushed by the oppression of what's going on, and to remember that those human faces, those little girls, those Miriams, do exist, who, in spite of all that's going on, still have hope. And we have to remember that face, the young child, the opportunity that might be missed if we don't do something.
One of the themes of today is, communication is building bridges. And is there, since we have a number of journalists here, something that, in terms of the situation on the ground, that is not being told, or something that we should be focusing on when we think of refugees, particularly those who actually meet the definition that have left the country, but also I think we were talking, Ed and I were talking a little bit before, about those who haven't left, and how do we, we don't want to be bringing people that have been in a land for over 2,000 years, going back generations. How do we support? Is there a story that really is not being told, or something that we should be telling that maybe from each of your organizations that we should use this opportunity to speak of?
In covering some of the stuff that's been going on in Central and East Africa, we've seen recently, or maybe have not seen recently, and maybe that's the problem. 2 years ago, there were 248 or 270, depending upon who counted, young women that were abducted, taken by Boko Haram. And I remember right after that, there were these, bring back our girls, and everybody had it. Michelle Obama, everyone. There was thousands of Twitter and, Facebook posts and Snapchat, everything. It was all over the place. And it seemed, okay, this is great, something's going to be done. And I remember 4 months later, Archbishop Kaigama from Nigeria came to visit New York. And we had lunch with him, and we were talking about the different things. And he was talking about, where are they now? Not the girls, but the people, the celebrities. Where have they gone? They've forgotten us. He says, but we haven't forgotten, meaning we, the church. And he says, and they will come back, and they will be broken and shattered. And we will have to rebuild them, because truly they will come back something less than human. Having known, victims of things like this, he understood that these people, these young women, would come back and have horrible lives in these last 2 or 3 years. But there's still someone that needs to be helped. And I ask people often, if, for example, Boko Haram, which has been in the news, did you realize that the vice premier of Cameroon, that his wife was abducted by Boko Haram and held for 2 months? And most people say no. And when you do a Google search, the only major news source was an Asian news agency, Christian news agency, out of the Philippines that was reporting on it. I mean, it was. I think it got 2 inches in the New York Times. And I don't think they covered anything other than that 2 inches. I could not find it. So oftentimes, when it's a cause célèbre, when you see these great stories, it gets covered and it gets headlines. But what happens to these other stories, these outliers, these groups that aren't being reported? And that's troubling, because we can't forget, we can't let the speed of the world diminish the fact that there are people out there that need to have their voices heard and need to be spoken for and also need help.
Does this work? For us, it's the story of how the church has always been there and will continue to always be there. And when we hear, in fact, Cardinal O'Connor, I'm having a senior moment. Cardinal Dolan recently was in Iraqi Kurdistan as our chair with Bishop Murphy in Rockville Center. And something that they commented on later, and the journalists that accompanied them on their pastoral visit, was the role that the priests and sisters and bishops played in accompanying their people as they fled the Nineveh plain. They were no different. They fled with whatever they had on their backs. They fled maybe with a cell phone, and that was it. They slept with the folks under the stars, accompanying them through the desert, trekking 60 miles northeast, and were as dazed and confused as the men and women who had just been roused from their sleep and forced out of their homes. And I remember our regional director, Michelle Constantine, we have a long-standing relationship with the Dominican Sisters of St. Catherine of Siena, which is an Iraqi religious community of women drawn from all of the churches in Iraq. And he called Maria Hanna and he asked her, what can we do? How are things, and what can we do? And she said, well, we're dazed and confused, and we're just trying to sort things out, because they had no idea where people were. They were experiencing the very same things that the people that they are called to serve do. Those same women have not stopped, by the way. Those men who are serving their displaced parishioners have not stopped to really give much time to think about what their own needs are. So I think that the story that needs to be told, that we'd like to see more of, is the heroic stories of the men and women who are motivated by the gospel, who are doing extraordinary things in extraordinary times with little or next to nothing. And I think that what we have seen, their constancy is faith-driven, but it's no different than what it was before their expulsion. They've been doing this the church has been the animus of so much good in that part of the world, or throughout the world. And whether they're displaced or not really doesn't seem to make any difference. They're doing what they do best: organize, counsel, teach, preach, and live. Those stories would really help our audiences understand better what is happening in that part of the world.
Just conscious of the time, and we did want to leave a few minutes if any of the audience wanted to ask any questions. I don't know if anyone has a question, we can pass off the microphone.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Melissa Rosati. I have two questions actually, but I'll ask this one first. What would you suggest as a beginning point for someone in a parish to set up grassroots social media on the ground around some of these core issues? In other words, what if churches had teams of volunteers that were trained in a process to be able to pick a cause and support it over time, which is what you're saying is needed?
Well, I'll speak for Aid to the Church in Need, in that we welcome that all the time, that we would like local parishes to take on projects and to adopt them and to make them personal. Because one of the things that you can do by doing that is you can partner with these people. You can accompany them on their journey through these difficult times. So if it's just a parish activity that people are just going to check the box and say they gave like an envelope, it serves a purpose. But there's so much more if you do this, if you do make a connection with a project. We've worked with some colleges like Steubenville and St. Francis College and others where the young students wanted to do this project to help.
So,
see the fulfillment there.
So in other words, does your organization have the starter kit, social media in a box, how to get started with your parish?
Yeah, we do have some tools. I mean, you can contact us, and I think.
Yeah, I think two things. It helps to have the pastor on board. We have a parish outreach program that, and always the invitation comes from the pastor. Oftentimes they're donors, or parishioners are donors, and they want more information from the organization, from Catholic Near East or what have you. So getting the pastor on board is helpful. The other thing is, it first and foremost, without even thinking about the tools, it's informing them. It's getting the parish behind you and first understanding what the issues are. Hearing from the field, hearing voices from Africa or voices from the Middle East, what the needs of the local church are, what has happened to them, but also to provide them with some inspiration and with a call to action, with an opportunity to make a difference. All of us have an opportunity to just affect change, even if it's just with one life, with either a prayer. We can never underestimate the power of prayer, or a very modest gift. All of it is important. But I think that informing consciences, informing minds is perhaps the best place to start. And from there, it's sort of organic. The social media, all of these other tools play a role in motivating and building up a grassroots network to advance a particular cause within your community.
Well, I'm Daniel Alfonso from Currents Net TV. We're talking about refugees, and I just want to ask the challenges as a journalist when you cover these kind of events, and how to be neutral when it comes to going and witness the human drama of, going from one country to another one, but also being fair with that treatment of the story when an audience is critical and say, hey, but they're kind of like invading some countries, yes or no, and how can I be smart enough to be fair, not only to the human touch of the story, but also the critical part of the story when uncovering refugees?
If I could, it's interesting. It's not just Europe where this is a problem. Right now, Lebanon has a population of, well, technically there are 4 million citizens in Lebanon, But now 1 out of every 3 folks living in Lebanon is from another country, from either Syria or Iraq. The impact on Lebanon, I'm just taking one country, is so significant that economically and socially, the country is on the brink of something. But it's always on the brink. We just don't know what that brink will be. If it will be civil war, if it will be economic collapse or social collapse, a rise in crime. So it's important that you acknowledge that we can't whitewash things. We, as an agency, we make some important distinctions here in terms of how we direct our aid. Yes, we're trying to funnel as much assistance as we can to those who have been displaced, to Lebanon or to Jordan or to areas within Syria that are under some government control and therefore some stability. But we also have to look at the populations that were already there and how they were impacted, and not forget about their needs now that they're jobless, because a doctor from Syria can take that job that a Lebanese doctor had for a third of the price. And that creates social resentment, all sorts of other problems. You have to recognize that there are situations where the host populations are impacted too. And just to deliver it honestly is being objective and not to whitewash it.
Yeah, I would compliment that exactly, that the important thing is the truth. Deliver the truth, and to do it with compassion, yes, but the other important thing is background information. We all the time think about media as something happening within 15 seconds. I mean, 100 years ago, you needed 2 verifications of a source before you ran it in an article. There's not the time anymore. So it's incumbent upon the reporter to really understand at least the very basics of what's going on, as Michael said. What's going on both to the refugee and to the host, or the current host, and to tell it in a way that really understands that it's just not one voice. It's one voice impacting many voices.
I think just one thing there is just, I think something both Michael and I was saying, is just that understanding of education, going back to that definition of refugee, goes back to 1951, which is the aftermath of World War II. And you hear in the news, people are invading Europe, or they're invading whatever country. But the idea is all those countries have signed an international treaty, and particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, the law says if someone is a refugee on that definition, fear of persecution because of one of those categories. Part of that treaty is someone is a terrorist or committed a crime, they're barred from being a refugee under U.S. law, but also international law. And I don't think people make those distinctions. And it may seem very legalistic, maybe because I go to law school and I'm into those legalistic things, but it makes a difference. If someone's entering a country, not because they're facing a disaster, but because their life, they're being targeted because of their race, their religion, of their political opinion, and it's their life. It's not, well, I want to make $1 million, I want to make but my life is in danger. Nations of Europe, 150 nations worldwide have signed the Convention of 1951, and it's been incorporated when you look at the United States. And if someone shows up at our borders and says, I have a fear, there's U.S. law that says there's certain things they have to do. In the United States, the vast majority, when we think of it, come through resettlement programs where they've been screened and all that. And people don't understand. There was an article just a few weeks ago that we were going through at school, that how come it's taking so long? Where are the Syrians in the United States? Well, the process for someone to be classified through U.S. resettlement is 2+ years. They go through screening. They've gone through the UN screening, and then on top of it, the U.S. government does an inter-screening, which is perfectly fine. But I think people don't understand, and I think it's very nuanced. But when you're talking about who these people are, we lump them all in together. And I think the one thing for the media can do is really educating the larger population, what it means to be a refugee, and that fear of persecution, and understanding that it comes out of the context of the aftermath of World War II, where we said never again, and how often since World War II have we said those words, never again, never again. And I think, as both Ed and Mike was saying, being honest and just trying to convey that to those who may see it in 15 seconds, may see it in a minute, may see it, and there is the rapid pace. But I think just educating, I think it really changes because it puts that human side on it.
And I think respecting too the different, respecting too the different roles that forms of media play. Social media is great for capturing a headline, but it's also great for directing you to something that's much more intense. Magazine articles, newspaper articles, collections, are very important. Different journals that discuss these things. It's not just Facebook posts and Twitter and other things. They can help raise the issue, but really to understand it is to look at some of these, at some publications, and I always urge people to look at the Catholic media. There's really good stuff that is produced in Catholic media worldwide, in the English as well as French language. Look for that material and utilize it, because many of us still do use content. We still do have resources and verify facts and try not to be caught up in some of the ideological messes that exist out there, but really advance a perspective that is faith-driven and honest and objective as one can be. And I think DeSales, by the way, does a great job of doing that.
Well, I just want to thank Michael and Edward for and to thank also DeSales for putting this day together. It's been an honor for me to be part of this, and for all of you for joining. And like I said, I think this topic, we hear about it, it's in the papers, but the role that we all can play as individuals, as reporters, as organizations, and I thank you. I believe food is being served, so I never want to be known for keeping someone from food. So thank you again.
Thank you.